Jan Wolkers, Kort Amerikaans. Chapter 1. Stark naked, just this tiny little thing here, said Peter, patting his crotch with satisfaction. Eric looked up at the cinema billboard hanging across the Breestraat above the entrance of the Trianon. A woman was pictured on it who at first glance appeared to be naked. It was as though her pubic hair was held in place with laces, like a false beard. Her breasts were adorned with petals, the nipples like fleshy pistols. Quivering little lightning bolts shot from her navel across her belly. Radio waves designed to be picked up by every male antenna. Triumphantly, she held a boa constrictor above her head with both hands. She has a diamond in her navel, Peter continued. It moves and sparkles when she dances. You can't believe what you're seeing. When did you go then? Eric asked absently. Last night. I'm going again, and maybe once more after that. Filthy bastard. Great though, isn't it? A woman who's not afraid to handle a little snake. They laughed and stopped in front of the post office entrance. I need to post a letter to my brother, said Eric, just grabbing some stamps. Maneuvering deftly with his folder of drawings, he was on his way to the art academy. He pushed through the revolving door. In the glass, greasy with handprints, he saw the cinema billboard reflected back at him. The naked dancer in the green shadow of a looming male head. The title that, in mirror writing, seemed translated into Greek. Inside the post office, a few old men sat dozing on the benches along the wall. Eric walked up to a counter, but there was no one behind it. The other windows were empty too. Do they still sell stamps here? He called out. He stuck his head through the window and saw that the staff had climbed up on their chairs and were peering out through the high windows. The idiots, still coming out on the street, said a girl. Why don't they stay where they are? Said a balding older man in a grey dust coat. They're asking for it. Eric moved quickly to the revolving door. Between the bristled brush and the doorframe, he could look outside without being seen. German soldiers were passing by with their rifles tucked under their arms. They walked like hunters in a beet field, slow and deliberate, staring down at the ground as though at any moment a partridge or pheasant might flutter up from between the cobblestones. Suddenly one of them bent forward and stared tensely at the street. Then he scraped the inside of his boot sole across the ground, called something out, and beckoned. 4 soldiers gathered around him. He pointed along the ground as though following a trail. Then they moved on with bowed heads to the other side. Eric noticed that the rifle butts, which had been half hidden under their arms, had all dropped simultaneously, as if on command, down toward their elbows. At the curb in front of the cinema lobby they stopped. Then 2 soldiers went right and 2 went left. The cinema was closed, the lobby empty. In front of the ticket booth stood a man-height board displaying showtimes and newspaper clippings behind glass. The soldier who had remained in the middle approached it carefully. Then he lunged forward and slammed the butt of his rifle against the side of the board. With a loud crack and the shattering of glass, it toppled sideways. On the ground sat a man with his back to the street. He looked as though he was kneeling there in prayer. The soldier pressed the barrel of his rifle against the man's shoulder. The man raised his hands and struggled to his feet. Halfway down his thigh, a large red stain soaked through his trousers. The other soldiers patted and prodded him, felt through his pockets. Then they pulled his arms down, grabbed him by the wrists and dragged him away. Poor bastard, Eric heard someone say at the window. Look how they're kicking him into that car. I've got quite a haul today. Imagine if your son were among them. With a jolt, Eric thought of Peter, who had stayed waiting outside. Had he seen them coming and managed to escape? It seemed almost impossible. Everything had happened so fast. He didn't dare go to the other side of the door to see further down the street. He walked slowly back to the counters. "Did they get a boy in a long raincoat?" he called out. They turned around as though the danger from outside had pushed its way right up to the counter. The older man in the grey dustcoat stepped stiffly off his chair and came to the window. "A boy my age," said Eric, "in a long raincoat." "One with a fine head of hair, perhaps," said the man. Eric stared at him and swept the lock of hair from his forehead over the scar on his left temple. "No, shaved head," he said. "The van was already full," said the girl. "They only took one man out of the cinema here. He was in a pretty bad state. That wasn't him." "How in God's name did you get in here?" the man asked, settling onto the stool behind the counter and mechanically flipping open his stamp folders. "I'd just come inside when they arrived," Eric answered. "They could bloody well have come in after you. Then we'd have had all that trouble in here too. Why don't you lot stay indoors?" "10 grey ones with the water horse," said Eric, and pulled the letter to his brother from his inside pocket. "You're a cold one," said the man. Reluctantly, he tore off a strip of stamps and slid them across the counter to Eric. Without looking at the man, Eric stuck 5 stamps on the letter and let the rest slide into his drawing folder. The street lay deserted as after a storm. The soldiers were gone. Eric walked to the spot where the soldier had crouched down, blood on the ground, drops of blood forming a trail toward the cinema. He followed it to the lobby, then turned left into the alley beside the building. "I'll have to go to Peter's parents later," he thought. But maybe he saw them coming, those Krauts. Maybe they were only after that one man. But then he would have gone on to the art academy. Halfway along the Pieterskerkgracht, he stopped and looked at the facade of the art academy across the water. Just below the roofline sat 2 gable stones on which, against a velvet soft background, in golden capitals, "Rest begets desire, and desire with God is rest." He strolled slowly across the street. To the left of the green door hung a sign, "Drawing and Painting Academy, Ars Emula Naturae." He looked for a bell but couldn't find one. He knocked several times with his fist and the door gave under the blows. He pushed it open and entered a spacious marble hall with 5 doors leading off it, 4 painted ochre yellow, 2 on the right and 2 on the left, and a green door straight ahead between 2 arched windows through which a cold light fell. He looked at the plaque above the door with its sunken golden letters. Founded by Jan Kneppelhout. Suddenly one of the doors on the left swung open. Someone peered at him through the narrow gap. As he walked toward it, the door swung wide and a large man in a white coat with a broad-brimmed hat stood in the doorway. He looked like the uncle of Benito from the illustrated album Benito the Young Wanderer, the one in the pictures who always seemed to have just been crying. His face was so heavily watercolored in red. "Did you knock?" the man asked. "On the outside door," said Eric, "but nobody answered, so I just came in. I wanted to come and paint here, with a nude model if possible." "Nude? You just come dressed, son," he said with a loud laugh, clattering an indestructible set of false teeth back and forth behind his broad, slack lips. "I know what you mean," he continued. "But nude, that's difficult. Gets too expensive. There's only one student left here, a rather peculiar man. Doesn't want anything to do with naked women, if you ask me. Besides, the models have all become thin as rakes. They're ashamed to undress. Can't you bring a girlfriend who isn't too shy?" "I do have a girlfriend," said Eric, "but she's covered in scabs. Her skin is covered in bread rash. She won't undress in front of others. She won't even do it for me. Well, perhaps that's just as well. He looked at Eric. How old are you, actually? I'll be 19 in October. Shouldn't you be working in Germany? I've gone into hiding to avoid the labor service. I'm staying in an attic room in the city. He was startled by his own confession, but looking at the man, he decided that someone wearing a broad-brimmed hat and a paint-smeared white coat couldn't possibly be an informer. My mother comes every day by tram to bring me a pot of food, he continued. That's a risky business, said the man. But let me introduce myself first. Van Grauw. He extended a large hand, which, when Eric placed his narrow white hand in it, seemed even redder than his face. Black hairs grew on it, curling over at the tips like insect legs. Eric van Polgest, said Eric. So you want to come and paint here every day? Only in the afternoons. I work in the mornings. I paint lampshades. Lampshades? Said Van Grauw. With 17th century naval battles, there's enormous demand for them. People are becoming more and more interested in our glorious past. There's not much else left to buy, after all. Van Grauw shrugged, extended his arm so that an equally hairy wrist emerged from his coat sleeve, and glanced at his watch. I don't have time to show you around the academy now. As far as I'm concerned, you can start tomorrow. If I'm not here, come through this door. He walked to the green door and opened it. Eric came to stand beside him and looked out onto a courtyard paved with yellow stones, between which poisonous green moss grew. A large elder bush kept the atmosphere damp. You go through that door, Van Grauw continued, pointing to a rickety door in the building bordering the courtyard. You'll see a staircase. Go up. You'll find the student studio from there. He closed the door, placed his hand on Eric's shoulder, and walked with him to the outside door. It's quite something, starting to paint now. These aren't exactly cheerful times. Now that I'm out of the house, I finally have the chance. My family are reformed. Well, that's not exactly an environment that encourages you to paint freely. Pray and work is our motto, said Eric with a bitter smile. You don't need to bring any materials. There's plenty here. A simple, still life, that's the best place to start. He looked at Eric's drawing folder. Do you have work with you? Eric nodded and handed him the folder. Van Grauw opened it, and the strip of stamps fell to the floor. He picked them up and examined them briefly. The water horse, he said. A Germanic symbol. The creature was believed to foretell people's deaths in the old days. A beautiful stamp. He tucked the stamps back into the folder and leafed through the drawings. Each time he came across a self-portrait among the landscapes, he glanced briefly and searchingly at Eric. I wonder if you'll notice the scar, Eric thought. A somber collection, said Van Grauw with a slight edge of mockery. A little wild, but I see promise. Chapter 2. Paul? Paul? Because the Jonkheer was descended from French nobility, his wife called his name from the bottom of the stairs, as though someone from Warsaw lived in the house. Jonkheer d'ailleurs put down his brush, taking care that the paint-laden hairs extended beyond the edge of the desk. He was a small man of around 60. His face was an unhealthy pale pink, scored with horizontal wrinkles like a piece of veal on which the butcher has marked his cutting lines. He heaved himself out from behind the hulking desk and, before leaving the room, came to stand beside Eric for a moment. Eric was bent over the light box, tracing the firing of cannons during the 4-day sea battle from a reproduction onto tracing paper in East Indian ink. "That's no good at all. That is simply dreadful," he said in his pedantic castrato voice, raising his hairless eyebrows in horror. "It's not only dreadful, I would even call it repellent. But that's gunpowder smoke. Surely you can see that. It needs to be done delicately. You must break the outline here and there. That creates suggestion. Now it looks as though the smoke clouds are being held together with thick black rope. How you're ever going to become a painter," he muttered through his colourless lips, and left the room shaking his head. Eric was glad to be rid of the sour smell that rose almost visibly as vapour from the man's suit. "Let him try it himself," he said to Ellie, a blonde Jewish girl who sat at a drawing table by the window with her back to him. "And what does that Rembrandt of the twilight hour do anyway? He smears our drawings with the most dreadful colours, pure, filthy tobacco juice. There's cobalt blue and cadmium red in that paint box of his, for God's sake. He sticks those brushes of his into his stinking pipes," said Ellie. She stood up and walked behind the desk. "Just look at that sea. Unbelievable." Eric came to stand beside her and put his arm around her waist. "That's kale that's been boiling for a day. No wonder they fight so bravely on those ships. If you lose, they keel-haul you through that mess of his." "I don't even want to think about it. You wouldn't even sink into it." "Walking on water like Peter is child's play on a sea like that. You'd only get wet soles." While talking, he had carefully pulled her jumper out of her skirt and slipped his hand through the opening. He took a piece of her camisole between his fingers and rubbed it gently across her back. "Is that really necessary?" asked Ellie. "It's nice to have your back rubbed like that. If Clark Gable were doing it, and you have quite a nice girl of your own, or are you trying to tell me it was your sister waiting for you?" "She's only 17, not much better. Kissing and a bit of pressing against each other in a doorway. That's as far as it goes. You could teach me a thing or two." "Oh, please, I'm not giving love lessons," she said. "Then I'll have to force you," he said with a grin. "I can make you do whatever I want. Dance like Salome, naked with the jonkheer's severed head on a silver platter." "You force me," said Ellie and thrust her hips backward. Eric moved his hand toward her warm, damp armpit. She didn't press her arm against her body. Suddenly he pulled the lower edge of her bra forward so that her breast fell out like a pudding from its mold. With his fingertips he rubbed the nipple hard and pinched it gently with his nails. "I could threaten to report you if you don't do everything I say." "Then you'd go down with me," said Ellie, and turned so that her breast slipped from his hand. Eric withdrew his hand from her jumper and smelled it. "Now you're going to say I smell." "You smell nice. Of summer and all that mess. Real soap. I suppose I wash with clay soap." "That's why you have such a grey face," said Ellie. Eric walked to the window and leaned on the sill, staring outside. An army-coloured car pulled up in front of the Ortskommandantur. The driver got out quickly, walked around and held the door open for a senior officer. "Did you know Peter was arrested?" he said. "That blonde boy who came to collect you yesterday." "Less than half an hour after that. I went to his parents last night. He's been put to work digging trenches in Katwijk. They came to collect clothes from his home. I barely escaped myself. He was waiting for me outside the post office when the raid happened. If I hadn't needed stamps, I'd have been taken too." "You all carry on as though nothing is happening." The staircase creaked. Eric moved away from the window and Ellie slid behind the drawing table. "He's always trying to catch us out," she said. "He probably thinks we're going to lie down on the rug." "Does he ever try to seduce you?" Eric asked, wiping the ink from his pen with a cloth. "Now and then. It's actually a bit pathetic. When you're alone with him in the afternoon." "Are you mad? No working time must be lost." "Not on the boss's time. His wife goes to the grandchildren at the weekend," he says then. "If times weren't so dreadful, we could go out and paint the town together." He rubs his little hands with delight as though it's all just a joke. But then he comes knocking at my door, asking if I'd like to come for a drink before bed. But I always have, you know what. He holds out rather a long time behind that door. Soundlessly, Eric walked to the door and yanked it open. Jonkheer d'ailleurs stood bent behind it, his head at keyhole height. He crouched down and straightened the small rug. "Who keeps tripping over these rugs without laying them straight again?" he mumbled. Then he looked up at Eric with apparent surprise, as though only now noticing the door was open. "Did you need to get through?" he asked, straightening up. "It's time," said Eric. He walked to the light box and switched it off. "Don't forget that rag," said d'ailleurs, pointing with distaste at Eric's fur jacket hanging over a chair. "No, certainly not," said Eric. He slipped on his fur jacket, said his goodbyes, and went whistling shrilly down the stairs. Outside, he smelled the phlox blooming in the front garden. He crossed the street and walked between the plane trees standing in a double row on the grassed strip in the middle of the road. He looked at the statue of Boerhaave rising at the beginning of the avenue, above a dark green swell of evergreens. Eric suddenly thought of the postcard Uncle Leo had sent from Paris just before the war. It, too, had shown the dark silhouette of a statue of a man with a cloak thrown broadly around his shoulders. "Next year, it'll all be over," he thought. "Then I'll walk along that boulevard. It can't be much longer. This will be the last winter of the war." He glanced at the clock tower of the academic hospital. 1:05. He turned left onto the Rijnsburger Weg. When he was nearly at the level crossing, the barriers came down. A man ran to the middle of the road and ducked under the barrier with bowed head. On the other side of the tracks, he sprang nimbly over the closed barrier. Eric crossed the road and climbed the wooden railway bridge. He stopped on the bridge above the tracks. Through the gaps between the planks, he could see the rusty gravel lying between the sleepers. He looked over the railing to see if the train was coming. The rails lay gleaming white in the sun, shooting out into the meadows beyond the city, until they were pinched together in the darkness of a tunnel, like a hand gripping a bunch of spaghetti. A white cloud came, growing larger and longer, blue and orange in the sunlight. Eric was suddenly wrapped in a cloud of steam. For a few seconds, "Nobody can see me," he thought. The perfect person in hiding. Chapter 3. In front of the academy the heat was oppressive, but in the courtyard it was so cold that a whole season seemed to have passed in the few seconds it had taken Eric to cross the marble hall. It was slippery as clay soil in November. He had to walk carefully to avoid sliding on the moss. In the right wall of the courtyard were 3 large windows behind which rows of wheelchairs stood. The Green Cross Supply Depot, thought Eric. He had seen the sign for it on the facade of the building next to the academy. He walked to the door Van Grauw had shown him the day before and went inside. Through the round window above the door, a cool, clear light fell into the stairwell. He climbed the oak staircase, which curved left and opened onto a corridor. In the wall was a window through which Eric looked down into the courtyard from above. In the Green Cross depot, an old man moved stiffly back and forth along the paths left between the wheelchairs. With a resentful movement, he straightened a chair that had gone crooked, then walked to the window. He bent his knees slightly, shook his lower body, gave some confined body part more freedom of movement, and looked up to check whether anyone had witnessed this intimate adjustment. When he saw Eric standing at the window, he frowned disapprovingly and suspiciously, creating a deep furrow above the bridge of his nose. Eric nodded solemnly, but the old man clenched his fist, made an effort to raise it, then let his arm drop back to his side with a gouty movement, and walked away from the window. Eric moved on and opened the door at the end of the corridor, and found himself in a spacious room with a ceiling of thick beams. In the left wall were 3 large windows, but the abundance of light that poured through them could not dispel the shadows hanging between the beams, so that the deep space gave an impression of mystery. In the wall opposite the door stood 3 cupboards. The door of the middle one was open. On the shelves stood props for still lifes. A row of skulls, some gleaming white, earthenware, stuffed birds deformed by dust and moth, old books bound in leather and parchment, their titles sometimes written in faded ink on the spines. Godly Meditations on the Miracles of Christ by Romualdus Rombouts. Dutch Proverbs, elucidated for a thorough understanding of the mother tongue of the fatherland, by Carolus Tuinman. Against the back wall, painting easels had been pushed together. Only in the middle of the student studio stood a single easel, with a canvas on it. Eric walked toward it, but before he had even seen what was depicted on the canvas, he noticed the still life with the white skull, the blue bottle, and the violin. It was arranged on a large drawing board laid across a crate, right beside the door through which he had entered. The violin leaned at an angle against the wall behind the skull. The bottle stood beside the skull on the window side. Light fell through it, casting a blue patch on the left temple of the skull. Then he looked at the painting. He took a step backward and held his breath. The colors of the still life had been rendered with great accuracy, but the light falling through the bottle onto the side of the skull had been painted purple-brown. "I am in danger," thought Eric. The man who painted this must have known I was coming. Van Krauw couldn't have painted this. He wouldn't come and work in the student studio. But perhaps he had told that peculiar painter a new student was coming. "You'll recognize him easily. He has a large scar on his head, exactly where that blue light falls on the skull. Except it isn't blue. That would be too much to hope for. It's a hideous purple-brown." He had picked up a brush, mixed some paint on the palette, and painted over the blue on the skull. Ridiculous to think it. Van Grauw wasn't going to ruin a painting just to describe him, and yet there had to be more behind it. Because how could that painter have come to use such a wretched color for that blue reflection when he had rendered all the other colors faithfully? He took a few steps forward and bent his head until it was close to the canvas. He saw that beneath the purple-brown lay the original blue, and that the painting was dry except for the paint on the side of the skull. He picked up the brush lying on the easel in front of the canvas and drew it across his index finger. Then he walked to the small sink in the left corner of the studio. He pressed his face almost against the mirror above it and held his index finger against his temple. Exactly the same color, he thought. It's as though the paint is on my head and has transferred itself to my finger. He smeared paint on the glass at the spot where the scar was reflected. You couldn't see it. Perhaps it's a weak joke, he thought. Smeared on the skull while I was coming upstairs. Perhaps that painter saw me coming across the courtyard from a window. The scar was on that side. From above, it must have been visible. Eric turned and looked at the walls and ceiling. But there were so many holes and cracks that he could be watched from 100 different places. He walked to the door between the sink and the cupboards. At eye height, a card had been pinned. Van Grauw, artist. He knocked on the door and stood listening carefully for a while. Then he pressed the door handle down and pushed, but the door didn't move. There was no give at all. It was as though bolts had been slid across on the inside. He walked to the nearest cupboard and pulled it open. Against the back wall was a coat rack. On one of the hooks hung a grey dust coat. In a corner stood an antique rifle with its barrel on the ground. The stock was inlaid with elegantly engraved metal plates. Eric picked up the rifle, slung it over his shoulder by the strap, and walked to the mirror. He looked at himself with a somber, fanatical expression. "The uprising spreads like a raging fire," he murmured. "Armed civilians have managed to seize the most important buildings. The enemy has retreated to positions surrounding the city. Under the inspired leadership of Eric van Polgeest, who despite a serious wound to the left temple played the lion's share in driving out the enemy, the struggle will continue to the bitter end. Victory or death is the motto of this indomitable hero." He regarded himself gravely for a while, then put the rifle back and looked in the rear cupboard. But this one, like the middle one, contained only props for still lifes. And yet I must investigate everything. There could be secret spaces here, he thought. He left the studio and went out into the corridor. Opposite the window through which he had watched the old man was a door. He opened it and found himself in a storage room. Plaster casts stood under a grey horse blanket of dust, and in a corner a skeleton hung loosely from a stand. Everywhere on the floor lay painted pieces of canvas that seemed to have been torn from their stretcher frames in fury. As though the floor were strewn with twisted pottery, failed vegetables, and apples that had refused to become round. Suddenly Eric noticed that the storage room had no ceiling, that the space continued above. That pale light fell in from a dirty, slanted skylight. He walked to a ladder leaning against the back wall and climbed up. When his head came above the level of the wall, he saw an attic so vast it seemed to extend in every direction to the horizon. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw that the roof came all the way down to the floor. Nowhere was there any panelling. The grey roof tiles sagged against the battens like a scaly skin too loose for its body. In the middle of the attic, a small hut had been built from reclaimed timber, its door secured with a padlock. Eric wanted to walk toward it, but when he lifted his hands from the floor, they were grey with dust. A clear imprint had been left in the wood. "I would give myself away if I walked over there," he thought. "In the future it may be necessary that nobody suspects I know there is an attic here. Besides, nobody could have been there to peer at me through the floor. Then I would have to see footprints as clearly as the prints of my hands. Unless there is another entrance." He strained his eyes but could discover nothing of the sort. He turned on the ladder and looked down into the storage room. On a low table beside the door stood a plaster torso of a Greek Venus. Against the wall behind it stood a large mirror, its backing peeled away in so many places that the reflection of the torso appeared to suffer from a terrible skin disease. He climbed down the ladder and walked toward it. From the floor he picked up a cloth and beat the dust from the torso. Then he pressed himself against the plaster. He felt the hard buttocks against his lower body, the shoulders against his chest. He rested his chin on the small, round disc where the neck had been cut away. With his left hand, he stroked the pointed breasts. His right hand he let drift down along her belly to where the mound of Venus swelled forward between the folds of the thighs. He clenched his hand into a fist and extended his index finger like an erection. My face is almost as pale as the plaster, he thought, looking in the mirror. It looks as though it is attached to the torso, as though it forms one whole with it. A hermaphrodite becoming aroused by stroking its own breasts. He turned the torso on its flat round base so that its front faced him, wrapped his arms around her, pressed her firmly against himself, and closed his eyes. I no longer need to be alone, he thought. At last I have found a woman I need not fear will see the mark on my head, who will not leave me. Before we had even seen each other, they had already tried to ruin things between us. But she pays no attention to the shadow that falls across my face. His lower body convulsed wildly against the plaster, his nails scraped across the buttocks. He forgot the cracks and holes in the walls through which he might be watched. He forgot even the scar, which had grown darker with arousal. Chapter 4. Perhaps it will be with us as with Apollo and Daphne, only in reverse, thought Eric. I turn to plaster when I touch her. The calcification has begun. He walked to the sink and scrubbed his hands under the tap, but he couldn't get the plaster out from under his nails. Boys who pleasure themselves over a photograph of Marika Rook are in a better state than I am, he thought. My father had it right when he used to watch me crouched over my terrarium of frogs and toads. If you gave your parents and brothers and sisters as much affection as you give those cold-blooded creatures, things wouldn't turn out so badly for you. You sit there fussing over those animals, while all you do for us is make our lives miserable. If you ever get a woman, she'd better have the patience of Job and the wisdom of Solomon. At least the Greek Venus has the patience of Job, he thought. He scrubbed so vigorously that the brush flew out of his hand. When he bent down to pick it up, he noticed the keyhole in the door of Van Grau's studio. He crouched in front of it and looked inside. On a painting easel stood a large portrait of a well-groomed young man in a grey overcoat. In his right hand, he held a pair of yellow gloves with self-assurance against his chest. His other hand rested on the head of a large borzoi. The blue of the sky against which the young man stood had been painted around him as though a dark silhouette would remain if he were to walk away. That's quite something else, thought Eric. I always feel as though I dissolve into my surroundings, confusion and uncertainty. But he cannot be cancelled out. Even when he is absent, his absence burns a hole in the azure. He tried to see more of the studio, but the only other thing he could make out was a still life with a halved red cabbage standing on the floor. A dirty red globe veined with white. When he tried to stand up, he saw that something dark was silently approaching him through the studio. He spun his head around in fright. A few steps away stood Van Grau in the officer's uniform of the WA. His eyes lurked beneath the gleaming peak of his cap. Eric felt the sweat break out on his face. His body began to tremble. The figure before him seemed to crumble, to fall apart. He had to close his eyes against the dizziness. When he opened them again, Van Grau stood before him like a poster for the Eastern Front. His body was relaxed. A broad smile spread across his face, as though the resentment had slid down into the folds of his neck. Everyone is always curious about what lies behind that door, he said. Eric struggled to his feet. He heard the leather of the boots creak and the riding breeches rasp against each other as Van Grauw walked to the door and opened it for him. "Come inside," he said with a broad sweep of his hand. "I have no secrets from anyone." Eric swallowed several times but could say nothing. Dazed, he walked into Van Grauw's studio. "A son of Comrade Kroos, our group leader," said Van Grauw, pointing to the painting. "A shame, a very gifted boy. Killed on the Eastern Front 3 months ago. Tragic, but also magnificent because he did his duty." "He'll make me do my duty too," thought Eric as he wiped the sweat from his face. Behind barbed wire in a concentration camp. "When I leave, there'll be a few men in plain clothes in a doorway. They'll follow me unnoticed until my mother too is caught red-handed helping those in hiding. They'll interrogate and torture her until she confesses that my brother is in the resistance." Van Grauw walked to a cupboard and took out a pack of cigarettes. "Have a cigarette. They're English." "I don't smoke," said Eric. "Take the whole pack then. I don't smoke myself. I keep them for visitors. Your father must smoke. Or perhaps you have a brother who smokes." Eric nodded while mechanically accepting the pack and putting it in his pocket. But suddenly he realized that Van Grauw had probably given him the cigarettes to put him in double jeopardy. Going into hiding and black market trading in cigarettes. "I have to get rid of them later," he thought, and kept holding them tight in his trouser pocket. "I have something else for you," said Van Grauw. "If you don't smoke, you probably have a sweet tooth." He walked to another cupboard whose shelves were stacked with tins of food and stoppered jars of rice. "Do you like these?" he asked, and handed Eric a flat, oblong bottle of boiled sweets. Eric took the bottle with his left hand. "Are you left-handed?" Eric released the cigarette pack, took his hand out of his pocket and shook his head. "Not that that would be any objection, mind you. Leonardo da Vinci was even left-handed." Eric examined the bottle of sweets. It was exactly like the ones Uncle Leo used to give him for his birthday as a child. Inside were matte, gleaming silver cushions with coloured stripes running across them. He tried to shake them loose just to have something to do. "That won't work easily. They've been there for years. I'd try it at home carefully with a knife, or else just tap the bottle until it breaks." "At least he's assuming I'll make it home," thought Eric. Suddenly Van Grauw grabbed him by the chin and turned the left side of his face toward him. "Now that is a truly Germanic profile, or Roman, but that's more or less the same thing, since the Romans based their sculpture on the Germanic type, which was very fashionable at the time. You know, they had quite some success in the arenas, and the emperor's personal bodyguards consisted mainly of Germanic men." He released Eric's chin and continued, "And the skull, too. High, without that primitive back of the head. Yes, if the Russians come here, we'll all go under, we high-skulled ones." He shrugged his shoulders as though trying to protect himself from an imaginary bullet to the neck with the collar of his uniform jacket. "They'll only let the Mongols live," Eric heard himself say suddenly. Van Grauw looked at him searchingly for a moment. "I can take a joke perfectly well," he said. "But this is deadly serious. Here, take a look at this." He took a booklet from the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and leafed through it. Eric recognized it. A year ago it had been distributed door to door. On the cover were photographs of German soldiers being welcomed as liberators by the cheering population of Ukraine. Inside, photographs of Bolshevist atrocities, pits full of mutilated corpses, prisoners emaciated to the bone. His father had said they were all Jews, and he would know, having been born in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam and lived there until his 30s. Van Grauw handed him the booklet, open to the photographs of the horribly filled pits. "Take a look at this," It makes your hair stand on end. They look like Jews, said Eric. Jews? Asked Van Grauw in surprise, coming to stand beside him. Those are typical Russian types. They're dark, too. Isn't it dreadful that such things are possible in our time? And if Germany were to fail to hold the line, all of Europe would become one great pit like that. Only through solidarity can we repel the barbarians. Because that is, for me, one of the most important facets of National Socialism, the unification of Europe. That requires a firm hand, and Hitler has one. Through parliamentary means, it would be a process taking at least half a century, and then it would be too late. We'd be permanently overshadowed by America and Russia. He narrowed his eyes and continued, I know at the moment there are things happening that I personally do not support, such as the forced deployment of labor. But if force had never been used, we'd still be reading the future from the entrails of sacrificial animals around sacred oak trees. He opened his eyes and looked searchingly at Eric. I must stay calm, he thought. Let me think of my parents and my brother. He nodded and tried to look as non-committal as possible. You don't have to agree with me, said Van Grauw. But you too will come round to our side one day. Once the war is won first. He took off his cap and tossed it with an elegant arc onto a small table. On his forehead, just below his hairline, a red mark remained as though someone had tried to scalp him with a blunt knife. What on earth have you been up to? He asked, looking at Eric's clothes, which were covered in white smears. I took the torso out of the storage room, said Eric in confusion. I wanted to use it for a still life, but I put it back because I thought it would be better to ask your permission first. You didn't go up to the attic? Asked Van Grauw. Eric looked at him briefly while brushing the white dust from his clothes. Is there an attic? He asked. The floor up there is so rotten, it's life-threateningly dangerous to wander about on it. As soon as the war is over, it needs to be replaced. So now you know. Forewarned is forearmed. He walked ahead of Eric into the student studio and said, Now let's get down to some proper work. When Eric walked past the window, he saw below in the Green Cross supply depot the old man standing at the window again. Van Grauw came to stand beside him. The old man's gaze rose as though he sensed he was being watched. When he saw them standing there, his mouth made a movement as though he snarled something. Then he walked away with a stiff back between the wheelchairs. That gentleman doesn't seem to like us much, said Van Grauw. Shall I help you arrange a still life? He asked, moving away from the window. May I try it myself first? But of course, said Van Grauw. Then he laughed slightly and said, You can use that torso for it too. A touch of feminine beauty can do us no harm in these gloomy times. Chapter 5. When Eric came out of the academy, he looked around as unobtrusively as possible. At the end of the street, the vocational school was letting out. Boys streamed noisily into the street. Opposite the academy, a man stood in a doorway, smoking a pipe with his eyes closed and his face turned to the sun. His arms loosely folded. Is he holding his face like that so he can peer at me through his eyelashes? Eric wondered. While he kept watching the man, he suddenly stretched out his right arm as though about to throw a ball. But the man's face remained unmoved. Only a thin wisp of smoke rose from his pipe. Eric walked to the edge of the pavement and moved along where the shadow of the houses came exactly to his shoulder. In the shop window of a bicycle dealer, he saw his brightly lit face pass by. Across the street, a young woman in a black raincoat stood in front of the window display of a grocer's shop. Eric could tell from the angle of her head that she was following him in the reflection of the window. Where did she come from so suddenly, he thought. She has blonde hair pinned up like all those fascist whores. They obviously want to catch as many as possible at once, so first they track my movements for a while. When the woman saw in the window's reflection that he was looking at her, she studied the display with great attention. What's she looking for there? He thought. There's nothing but empty display boxes for products that have long since disappeared. When he turned into the alley beside the cinema, he looked back. With bowed head, the woman strolled slowly in his direction. At the tram stop for the Oegstgeest line, he stood in the back of a doorway. He crouched down and tilted his head sideways so he could see the clock on the tower of the town hall. 4:30. His mother could come at any moment. He walked to the corner of the doorway and looked carefully into the Breestraat. The blonde woman was nowhere to be seen. If she followed me, she's obviously hidden herself in a doorway too, thought Eric. She's making notes in a small notebook with the heading, The Case of E. van P. In the distance, the little tram came around the bend. When it stopped, a shower of blue sparks crackled from the overhead wire. His mother, who had appeared in the doorway, shrank back in fright. She waited a moment, then stepped out. She is a courageous woman, thought Eric. She braves hellfire for me. She spotted me from the tram already, but she keeps herself under control. She's pretending not to see me. I don't know anyone like her. What a ridiculous little hat she always wears. Perhaps as protection, it seems impossible that a woman with such a hat could be led away by SS men. Behind the tram, she crossed the Breestraat and went into the Maasmannsteeg. Eric sauntered slowly behind her. She stopped in front of a side window display. When she saw him approaching in the reflection of the window, she walked on. Eric came to walk right behind her. Her little hat bobbed up and down with each step alongside her chignon, which was pinned to it with a hat pin topped by a pearl-colored glass drop. Her stockings gathered in rings around her lower legs. Her heels were worn down on the inside so that her feet occasionally turned. He looked at her meager black coat stretched tight around her heavy body, rising in a slight curve toward the middle at the hem. A frayed, threadbare edge of her floral dress showed below it. He jammed his hands violently into his pockets, as though seized by a pain in his groin. He felt the pack of cigarettes and the bottle of sweets and gripped them tightly. "Mother, keep walking steadily," he said quietly. "I may be being followed. Go into Van Leur's doorway and put the pot down on the ground at the back. Go around the back of the town hall to the tram stop. Keep a close watch for a woman in a black raincoat with blonde hair pinned up. If you notice her following you, don't go home. Try to lose her. Walk into the Leiden woods if necessary. I'll walk past you now. Quickly take a pack of cigarettes for father and a bottle of sweets for the children." He heard his mother panting heavily. As he passed her, he took the cigarettes and sweets from his pocket and tried to hand them to her quickly, but she reached out her hand so nervously that she knocked the bottle and pack out of his grasp. He heard the bottle shatter behind him. When he turned, his mother was bent forward. Her chignon had come undone, her little hat dangling halfway between the cobblestones and her head on a thick strand of hair. Eric walked to the Nieuwe Rijn and stood with his back against the side of the bridge railing, from where he could see the full length of the Maasmannsteeg. Only a man with a wooden leg passed in a swinging rhythm. When his mother came out of the doorway, he walked back into the alley. She looked furtively back at the strange footsteps behind her. When Eric passed his mother, she didn't dare look at him. Her eyes seemed colorless with fear. Her face was flushed from bending down. Her chignon hung like a loose knot of wool below the brim of her hat. Eric went into the doorway and picked up the pot, which was wrapped in a nappy tied with a double knot over the lid. When he came back outside, the disabled man was sitting on the curb, greedily scraping the sweets together from among the shards of glass. His wooden legs stuck forward as though trying to trip Eric up. Chapter 6. Eric walked out of the Marsmansteeg. In the distance, his mother turned right toward the tram stop on the Breestraat. She's not being followed, he thought, looking around him. Perhaps that blonde woman simply found me attractive. But that's not possible. We need to be more careful, introduce more variation into the routine. I could get on at the stop where I always wait for her, then she can hand me the pot on the tram. At the next stop, she gets off while I ride on. Next time, she rides to the end of the line and can hand me the pot on the way back. We can vary it in hundreds of ways, right across the city. On even days, I wait at a stop going into the city, on odd days going out. And that too must change every week. There must be no chance whatsoever of them catching her, because then they'd get onto my brother's trail too. Tonight, I must write everything out clearly on paper, in block letters, otherwise she can't read it and everything will go wrong. At the fountain on the Vismarkt, he stopped and leaned against the railing around it. From the open mouth of a marble fish held in the arms of a naked little boy, a thin stream of water ran into the basin. The water ran over the edge so that the marble seemed to shiver. A boy came to stand beside him and pointed at the marble figure. "His dick's been knocked off," he said. Eric looked at him. His face was pale. Around his eyes, the flesh was light blue. "Did I ask you anything?" said Eric.
"I said something," said the boy, and walked on whistling.
They all look like the painting in the Lakenhal in which Mayor van der Werf offers his own arm as food to the starving population, he thought. They never got over the siege of 1574 by the Spanish. They've remained paupers and scroungers ever since, forever searching for hutspot with klapstok. Poverty radiates from them and has become hereditary. Even the fat ones don't look prosperous. They look hollow, as though inflated with a bicycle pump. He sauntered on beside the yellow water of the Nieuwe Rijn, which lay still and stank. On the Botermarkt, he stopped in front of the art dealer where he had placed 3 watercolors on consignment. He looked in the window at the 2 cityscapes and the dune landscape with the dome of the Kurhaus in the distance. Unsellable, he thought. I can't pay my rent this month. He walked to the door and looked into the shop. The owner hung gloomily over the counter with his plump torso, leafing through a book. When he saw Eric, slack folds pulled from the corners of his mouth toward his chin, and he shook his fleshy head slowly. Then he leafed on. He's obviously already sold them, that fat swindler, thought Eric as he walked away. Or traded them for a side of bacon. He's waiting until I've forgotten, and then he'll hand them over. But I'll come every day. Stupid not to ask for a receipt, and not to agree a clear price. Before going home with his pot of food, he walked past Klaver's bookshop across the water, where his girl worked as a sales assistant, and looked inside. There were no customers in the shop. Ans sat at a small desk behind a typewriter. From a green lampshade, light fell over her and drew a contour of gold along her black hair, which fanned out to her shoulders. He had to restrain himself from tapping on the window with the pot. "The Holy Virgin," he murmured. "That has to end today. After that torso, something warm and soft. Quick, home before my food gets cold." Through the Donkersteeg he walked to the Maar, where his attic room was in the house on the corner of the first side street. He sat on his bed, clamped the pot between his thighs, and untied the nappy. On the lid lay 2 folded pieces of paper, as though he needed to take powders before eating. In one was a 25-cent coin. On the paper his mother had written in her neat handwriting, "For a pear or an apple." In the other was celery salt he had asked for a few days ago. He opened the pot, laid the dripping lid on the floor, and looked without appetite at the mashed endive with a grey ball of imitation mince. He sprinkled a little celery salt over the greenish mush, picked up a fork from the table, and walked back and forth, eating. Van Grauw said nothing about the scar when he studied my head so eagerly for his pure Aryan characteristics, he thought. He didn't do that to spare my feelings. He can't know what it means to me, that I've been taunted about it since childhood. By my friends, by my brothers and sisters when we quarrelled. Brown cylinder oil stain, they called it. When I was about 7, I heard my father say, while I was hidden behind the sofa, that I was disgraced for life. Especially when my hair was freshly cut, you could see it badly. Crew cut, for God's sake. To save a few cents. You ask the barber to cut it shorter than last time, otherwise I'll send you back. Crew cut is what you say. You think money grows on my back. The money doesn't, but the children do, he thought grimly. It should be forbidden to have so many children that you lose count. After each child, a ball should be removed from the father. Then the trouble would be over after 2. He took the self-portraits out of the drawing folder and pinned them to the wall. Then he walked to the window and looked at the clock on the Hartebruchkerk. 10:02. I have to collect ants, he thought. It must and will happen now. Now that I have my own room, she can't say any more that she's afraid someone will come, and that's why she doesn't dare take her knickers off. I have to tease her with that torso, describe in vivid detail how beautiful those breasts are and those buttocks. Just tell her what I did with it, that I wiped the wetness from between its legs, that it only had a little trouble parting its thighs, or say that I painted from a model, that a complete stranger of a girl posed naked for me, and so she can't fall behind. He put the empty pot under the tap in the fixed wash basin and straightened the cover over his unmade bed. I need to steal a book, he thought. If she notices, I can ask her to hear my confession. Pray for us sinners, now and in the hour of our death. With a grin, he took off his fur jacket and grabbed his black raincoat from the hook. While going down the stairs, he pulled it on. He buckled the belt so tightly that the coat flared out slightly at the bottom. Van Grauw was obviously pleased when he saw the scar, but he concealed that under a lot of nonsense about Germanic and Roman types. He has a hold on me. He can tell the SD that there's no possibility of mistaken identity. Scar on left temple. But then why did he put on that performance this afternoon when I'd arranged that still life with the torso and the skulls? That it was a magnificent symbol of life and transience, die erhabene Frau, and those brown, toothless death's heads, der Tod und das Mädchen, and that kind of rubbish. The curtain had already been drawn across the door of the bookshop. Eric moved the brass door handle impatiently up and down several times. Footsteps sounded, soft and hesitant, almost only the clicking of heels. Ants opened the door. "Oh, it's you," she said in a husky little girl's voice. "No, Professor Backfeet's here for the collected works of Victor Hugo," he muttered as he walked into the bookshop. "I thought you were coming yesterday," she said. "I couldn't yesterday. Peter was arrested in a raid. I had to go to his parents." "Peter was arrested?" she asked anxiously. "By the Germans?" "No, by the English. Are you satisfied now?" She flinched at his outburst, walked nervously into the shop and said, "I'll go and get my bag." What a drip she really is, thought Eric. And she's Catholic too. Though she does let the priest French kiss her, that much is true. She's too scared to refuse. I should get a normal girl, not such an overcautious dormouse. A girl who comes with you to your room and undresses calmly, who drapes her underwear over the chair beside the bed and says, "Come on," and then parts her thighs. Ellie, for instance. Ellie would be like that, you could tell it from looking at her. Come hither eyes, as Peter had said. And he'd only seen her looking down at him from a window. He walked along the table on which art books and illustrated volumes were displayed. "I have to have that," he thought, and picked up a book with the title Anatomy for Artists. He rearranged the books around it so the empty space wouldn't show, and then looked at Ants. She stood with her back to him, combing her hair in front of a mirror on the back wall. Could she see me in the mirror? He wondered. I have to ask her something. If she talks, I can tell whether she's looking at me. "Was it busy today?" he asked. "Hardly anyone. A few students. Oh yes, and a strange little man who wanted prints of the human corpus, as he called it, for study purposes. But the owner saw through him. When he showed him a book with scientific illustrations, that wasn't what he had in mind." "The filthy swine," said Eric with feigned indignation. He tucked the book under his raincoat. He had to turn up his collar and do up the top button to hide it completely. He tapped on it a few times, but the front of his raincoat kept looking unnaturally rectangular. "What are you doing?" "I've got something on my chest," said Eric, coughing and holding back a laugh. "The man in a box who's square against everything," he thought. "The fatal shot that lodges in the Bible carried over the heart. Is the belt tight enough?" "Was it a little man with a shaved head and trouser braces on the legs of his trousers?" he asked. "He was bald." "Oh, then I know who it was. That was the cow licker." "What did you say?" "He's called the cow licker. He's a very strange man. You should watch out for him. His name is Mynheer Rosier. When he sees cows in a field, he thinks they're naked women and runs toward them, through ditches and manure. Nothing can stop him. He comes up to those Blarkop cattle through the duckweed and algae and embraces them. Usually he gets a kick for his trouble. Last year, Peter saw him in a field with his trousers open. He'd put a crate behind a cow and was trying to reach her, but the cow kept walking away. No wonder, because he's a horrible creature. When Peter appeared and asked if he could help, he said he wanted to swat a horsefly off the animal's back, but he did end up in hospital with foot and mouth disease. Eric had to laugh terribly. He laughed away all his fear of the entire day. "What are you laughing at?" asked Ants anxiously.
She came from the back of the shop and stopped by the spiral staircase.
"Yoo-hoo, I'm leaving," she called upward. "Are you locking up?"
She didn't wait for an answer, but walked straight to the door.
"That can't be true, what you said about that man," she asked. She followed him out of the shop. "As true as I'm standing here. He's an acquaintance of my parents. He used to be a deacon in our church. You always see him wandering through the city, a harmless lunatic, except for the livestock." "That such people exist," she said with revulsion. "The Bible already warns against it, against sodomites. That man is a sewer. I could tell you much more about him, what he gets up to." "Not now," she begged. "It's such a beautiful evening. Are you walking me to the tram?" "First you have to see my room. I've been there so long and you still haven't come." She glanced at him fleetingly. His face was stern. She didn't dare refuse. "Just for a moment then, but I have to leave by 7. Walking along, he pressed her against him. Their hips knocked against each other with each step. "Why are you wearing your raincoat?" she asked. "You're sweating." "Don't pay such attention to me," he said peevishly. He took a quick step so he no longer felt her body jolting against him. "Are you angry now?" she asked miserably. He didn't answer. A gang of overgrown boys came past, shouting loudly. One of them turned and stopped. "Lord Despair with his girl," he shouted. Then he ran after his friends. At the bottom of the stairs they stopped. "Give me a little kiss," she said. "Then I'll know you're not angry anymore." What kind of childish talk is that? A little kiss. "That's what I used to say as a little girl before going to bed," she said bashfully. "Now you say it before going to bed too," thought Eric. "You just don't know it yet." He looked at her upturned mouth. Her arched upper lip curled slightly. Her plump lower lip came forward moistly. "She's actually very beautiful," he thought. "She looks like an angel by Leonardo da Vinci. The angels lay down by night. It must be exquisite to hurt her." "A little kiss," he said. "From me, you'll get a blazing kiss." He bent forward and sucked her mouth in. Her tongue slid from between her lips into his mouth and turned trembling around his tongue. She threw her arms around him. He placed his hands on her buttocks and pressed her lower body against him. It was as though she were sucking herself onto him so as not to fall backward. "Nice having that book between us," he thought. "As firm as that torso. She must think I have muscles of steel in my chest. The discus thrower and the little blind flower girl." When he released her mouth, it stayed open and moist for a moment. A mouth is a flower without a stem with a succulent pistil in the middle for pollen, he thought. Cut off and laid in a crystal floating bowl before the open window. Then the birds of heaven can come and peck into those soft lips. He saw them pulling the flesh out with their beaks like chewing gum. When they let go, it sprang back, but a small point of flesh remained upright, like pudding poured into a mold. "What are you thinking? You look so serious." "About you," he said. He let her go up the stairs ahead of him. He kept placing his hand on her calf. Her stockings sometimes caught briefly on the rough inside of his hand. "You shouldn't let a lady go first on the stairs," she said. "You should when she doesn't know the stairs and might fall. Mind you don't put a ladder in my stockings." At the last flight, he left her calves in peace. He took out the book and took off his coat. "They get narrower and narrower," she said, panting. "Are we there yet?" "Yes, that's the door." They went into his room. Hans put her bag on the bed and walked to the window. "You've got a nice view here. You look right at the Hartebruchkerk. You can confess through the open window if you like." "That's silly. At least you don't need a clock." Eric slid the book between a pile of drawing paper and hung his raincoat on the hook. Then he came to stand beside Anne's, put his arm around her hips and rocked her impatiently back and forth. "You haven't even looked at my room," he said. She turned and looked with concealed distaste at the self-portraits on the walls. "You should hang some nice prints on the wall and a batik cloth diagonally along the chimney breast," she said. When Eric undid the top button of her dress, she pushed his hand away anxiously and said, "Say, isn't it terrible that Peter was arrested? How did it happen?" "I needed stamps. He was waiting for me outside the post office. Suddenly I heard a shot. When I looked through the window, the Germans were pulling him out from behind a board in the lobby of the Trianon. Rather stupid to hide behind that. But I think he was looking at the naked photographs of that Marika Röck, because he could never get enough of those." "How terrible," she said. "It's honestly not the first time a man has been led to his ruin by a woman," he said, and continued undoing the buttons of her dress. She pressed her hand between her breasts and held him back. "Just a little wiggle," he said with a mean smile and slid his fingers under her hand. Did you go to that academy you were going to? She asked hurriedly. Yesterday Peter and I were on our way there when we got caught up in that raid. Today I worked there all afternoon. Did you enjoy it? Very much. We had a nude model. A girl your age was posing there. Gosh, that she dares to. Any normal woman would dare. Otherwise you'd better marry the priest. Come, he said, pulling her toward the bed. She sat on it a little stiffly and clumsily. Eric sat beside her, put his arm around her shoulders and kissed her fiercely. Then he pushed her back onto the bed. Her knees came out from under her skirt. She held them anxiously together. He stroked them, pushed her skirt up and moved his hand between her legs to where her stockings ended. Slowly, she relaxed. He released her mouth and looked along her body. Between her stockings and her woolen knickers, the pale stretches of thigh had widened against the edge of the bed. He worked his arm under her and slid her fully onto the bed. Move over a bit so I can get in too, he said. You're not going to do anything? She asked. He pushed her dress up to her waist and lay on top of her. The warmth of her belly and thighs pressed through his trousers. He kissed her again, slid his hand into her knickers and wriggled to get beneath her. She kept her legs pressed tight and arched her belly upward. Then she laid her buttocks on his flat hand. Nice like this? He asked. She nodded. Their teeth clattered briefly against each other. With his other hand, he undid his trousers and slid them down. Warm, isn't it? Shall I take your knickers off too? No, let's just do it normally. What's normally? Like we always do it in the park. You call that normal? Me just lying rubbing against you a bit. Don't you want to be a real woman? I don't dare, she sighed. You're wet between your thighs, he said, moving softly back and forth with his fingertip. She stiffened for a moment, then pressed herself against him again. He moved her knickers aside and thrust forward. Slowly, he entered her. He was startled himself for a moment at the warmth and moisture. You're hurting me, she said, and tried to sit up. Let me go, please, I beg you. I want to go to my mother. She suddenly wept with trembling lips. Eric dug his nails into her buttocks and slid her fully against him. Helplessly, she let her head fall back. In the corners of her eyes, silver drops appeared, her lashes stuck in them. She blinked and looked at him with her large, wet eyes. Her mouth trembled. I'm not hurting you any more now? Not so badly, she whispered. Will I have a baby now? She asked anxiously. Yes. How terrible, she stammered and began crying again. No, you won't. I'll be careful, he said. I'll let the wetness run along your thighs, just as with that Greek Venus of plaster, he thought, as he moved in her more and more wildly. Is it a pleasant feeling? He asked. Strange, she said, as though in a trance. As though you're opening me up. On the running board, she suddenly embraced him in a suffocating, sentimental way, as though he had given her God knows what. Her body shook briefly, as though she was sobbing. Then the little tram rode away. He looked for a moment at that dark little figure on the rear platform. Then he jogged into the Marsmannsteg. He tried to think of her body, but kept seeing her opened from her belly to her throat, red and bloody, full of tentacles, sticky little trunks, sucking mouths, the interior of a carnivorous plant. But her face remained marble white and serene, with dark, yearning eyes. The mother of sorrows, he thought. Through the narrow alley, he looked up at the stars in the green evening sky. At the bridge over the Nieuwe Rijn, he stopped, breathless. He saw the water in the basin of the fountain rippling and gleaming, and heard the glassy sound of the stream running from the fish's mouth. Suddenly it came over him again, and he sprinted through the Donkersteeg. He stopped in front of the Hartebruch Kirk. Just get a candle, he thought, a torso with skulls, and... He walked into the church. It was velvet black inside, as though everything had been blackened by the incense. Only near the altar a few candles burned. When his eyes had adjusted to the dark so that he could see there was no one kneeling between the pews, he walked to a large wrought-iron candelabra in front of a statue of Mary. He picked up the longest candle and looked up at that female figure of painted plaster. Even though you think no one sees you, God sees you always. A quiet, sad voice suddenly sounded. Eric stood still and tried to pierce the darkness with his gaze. Chapter 7. Eric was so absorbed in trying to match the color of a sapper's uniform from a reproduction in a history book that he only noticed he had bitten a deep gash in his lower lip when he threw down the brush in despair. The date, 1805, written beneath it in East Indian ink, had smudged so that the 0 looked like a 9. What does it matter anyway, he thought. 1895. Christ crucified in Enschede. In 100 years they'll be making lampshades with SS Sturmführers and Eastern Front soldiers on them. It's only a matter of time. Our history books proudly record that Dutch engineers heroically built bridges over the Berezina under enemy fire for Napoleon's retreating army. He looked around at Ellie, who was in the corner cutting a piece of paper from a large roll. She held the razor elegantly.
"Cut me a sheet of snow too," he said. "There's been quite a mess made here again. When the rat comes trotting in, I'll have to start over." She came to stand beside him and bent over the drawing. "That's simply no good again. That is dreadful," she imitated D'ailleurs' voice. "Can't you see that uniform is olive green and not some nasty clay color?" "Get away with that horrible knife," said Eric, grabbing her hand. "Let go." He released her hand. Ellie suddenly grabbed his hair and pulled his head backward. "Shall I follow through?" she asked defiantly. She placed the knife at his throat, but suddenly pulled her hand back in fright and put the knife down. Eric felt a warm trickle run along his neck. He stroked his hand along it, sticky and thick. "It's only a small cut," said Ellie. "You did it yourself. You pressed your neck against it." "I thought you were holding that knife." "Don't you have a handkerchief?" He shook his head. "Wait then," she said, and came to sit on his lap and pressed her lips against his throat. "You're not going to drain me like a bloodthirsty vampire." He put his arm around her and held her under her armpit. With his other hand, he stroked her thighs and moved upward along her suspender into her knickers. She briefly stopped sucking when his finger slid into her, then bit herself fast into his throat. Slowly he moved back and forth through that warm, moist groove between the hair. He could feel from her buttocks on his lap that she was working her muscles in the rhythm of his movements. "Delicious, that blood, while you do that," she said, panting. Eric looked up at the ceiling, at the garlands of plaster flowers and fruit trailing from the center toward the four corners. The plaster had turned brown from smoke and dust, like a set of teeth with decay. She let him go and hid her face in the hair beside his ear. Her panting moans gave way to suppressed whimpering. She turned her head in a stammering sigh and relaxed. "That's enough now," she said. She pressed her thighs tightly together. Her face was red to her roots. There was blood around her mouth. "Now get away there. I can't take any more. I'll go completely mad," she said. "Let me out then." She softened so he could withdraw his hand and laid her warm head against his shoulder. Then she sighed deeply. "Was it nice?" "You're so good at that. You've still learned quite a bit from that little girl of yours." Eric pushed his hand under her chin. "Let me look at you. Open your eyes."
Slowly she opened her eyes. They're cloudy. You can tell you haven't just come from the soup kitchen. You can always tell with me. You look sweet, little red eyes, he said, and kissed her on her nose. Isn't it ugly when I have these small eyes? Not at all. Very sweet. A little piglet. Ugh, yuck! She jumped off his lap and pulled her skirt down. I've never been so nicely fingered, she said while looking in her small mirror. When she had tidied her hair, she held the mirror in front of his face and said, Take a look. On his throat sat an oval wine-red mark like an amethyst brooch. She laughed triumphantly at him and tucked the mirror into her bag. Then she picked up the razor, cut a piece of paper for him too, and slid back behind her drawing table. She doesn't look Jewish at all, thought Eric, as he briefly smelled his fingers. She looks like Christina Söderbaum, Die Goldene Stadt. He walked to the lightbox and began tracing the sapper again. How do you come to be so blonde? He asked. I don't know, she said. My mother is dark and my father as red as a winter carrot. Are they in hiding? I don't know where they are. I haven't seen them in 3 years. You do know, but you don't want to tell me. Sensible. You can't trust anyone. Perhaps I spend my evenings selling Volk and Vaderland on the corner of the Breestraat. I don't doubt that for a moment, she said. How will you find your parents again after the war? An organization takes care of that, one that helps Jews in hiding. Every time someone changes address, it goes through their mediation. Why didn't you stay with them? I don't know, she said pensively. I've thought about it often. I think my parents thought it safer for me, because of my appearance, because I don't look Jewish. But they probably didn't want to tell me that. They told me everything, he said, as though in a trance. You're going to the institution. I'll have you taken away tomorrow. You are possessed by the devil. Eternal fire awaits you. When he had dipped his pen, a fat drop of ink fell on his paper, and he stood staring at it blankly. I know everything. From the moment I was born, he said with difficulty. I kept hearing a scraping sound. It came from the garden. My parents were laying a cement floor with trowels. When it was finished, they put me on it on a chair. They tied my feet to the rungs and built a wall of grey breeze blocks around me. They often spent hours whispering together about placing a stone. They were always busy. I can't remember it ever becoming night. He looked around at Ellie. She was bent over the drawing table, but she wasn't working. He could tell from her back that she was listening. He bent back over the light box and went on tracing automatically. When I could read, they put a stand in front of me with a heavy book on it, he continued. From time to time, my father would turn a page without looking at me. When I once turned a page myself, they tied my wrists to the arms of the chair. When the book was finished, they opened it again at the first page. I could only see the tops of my parents' heads above the wall. They were grey and tired. The heat from the light box made the sweat run down his face and drip onto the drawing, making the ink run. He scratched lines through it and smeared it with his fingers. Suddenly, he furiously crumpled the paper and threw it in the wastepaper bin. Then he sat, stunned, behind his drawing table and stared at the coloured drawing of the sapper. Perhaps he could turn that 9 back into a 0. He picked up the ink eraser and began carefully rubbing. What a frightening story, said Ellie. It's not a story, it's a life history, he said. So, hard at work here, said D'ailleurs, entering soundlessly. On his way to his desk, he bent over Eric's drawing and straightened up with a vicious jerk, as though something had splashed in his eyes. The horizontal wrinkles in his pale face had deepened, as though the flesh between them was bulging forward.
"Dreadful, simply dreadful," he said in a breaking voice, slapping his short little arm up and down a few times in displeasure, as though shaking down a thermometer.
"I do feel sorry for you, really sorry, but I can't say otherwise. It's appalling. You have not the slightest feeling for color. Just look at that uniform. You call that field grey? Well, I won't say what it looks like. It's a pity, but you have no feeling for refinement and nuance. What am I supposed to do with these products of yours? They're unsellable. And that date, that's equally wrong. 1895. Napoleon had been dead and buried for 3/4 of a century by then. But wasn't that when the Battle of Waterloo was fought, in 1895? Said Eric with sardonic conviction. Oh, go tell that to the cat. He picked up the drawing with a disgusted expression by a corner of the paper, walked with it to Ellie, and held it up to her provocatively. What do you think of that, my dear? Would you like to sit reading by the light of that? Not me, she said. D'ailleurs looked triumphantly at Eric. I hate reading by lamplight, she continued. A room should be either dark or properly lit. That is a most unusual standpoint, said D'ailleurs. Most people enjoy lamplight, but you'll have to agree with me that if you place a decoration on a lampshade, it must be a pleasure to the eye and not. He looked at the drawing as though being served a piece of rotten meat. Then he walked with it to the wastepaper bin and let it drop. After that he trotted to the door, opened it and stood in the doorway. Come along with me, he said. I'll show you something you can learn from. Eric followed him down the stairs. He looked with distaste at D'ailleurs' short, fat little body bobbing up each time he placed his foot on a lower step. He's a balloon that no longer has enough gas to float, he thought. Little blue balloon, he murmured. What did you say? Asked D'ailleurs. I'm curious. I often think to myself, that boy's hands look so refined, but he uses them like a bricklayer. You don't want to go the way of that half-cracked fellow we talked about last time. Van Gogh. Exactly, Van Gogh. That lunatic who cut off his ear. Eric looked at D'ailleurs' head. His small, crumpled ears, which looked like rooster combs that had suffered from frost, stuck out redly against the glass draught door with its sand-blasted heraldic figures. Some people are mad enough to leave their ears on their heads, he said. I don't understand that, said D'ailleurs. It must be a joke. He lightly threw open the door to the salon, and they went inside. In the back room, Mevrouw D'ailleurs stood at the window. D'ailleurs stopped in the middle of the salon and coughed. Oh, Paul, you gave me a fright, said Mevrouw. She came away from the window and slid the glass sliding doors almost shut, so that her head stuck forward between them, nearly caught. She looked at Eric and nodded to him in a stately, old-fashioned way. Then she withdrew her head and slid the doors closed. In front of the bookcase, D'ailleurs got down on his knees on the Persian carpet. Come and sit beside me, he said. He took a large book in a red linen binding from the cabinet. In golden letters it read, Sandro Botticelli. D'ailleurs pointed to it with a tender gesture. Botticelli, he lisped. Sandro, that's his first name. He leafed briefly through the book and then held it open for Eric. Just look at that. Just look at that. La primavera. That means spring, springtime. What refinement. Look at those bodies barely veiled by gauze. Look at the line of that leg, how delicate. You mustn't forget that my lampshades end up in the salons of the leading families of the land. I can hardly put a veil over a sapper's uniform, said Eric. You don't have to make Botticellis, understand me correctly. It's the principle. He leafed on and held the book before Eric again. Look, another wonderful example of what I mean. The birth of Venus from the foam of the sea. Look at those small, round, tits, Eric completed. Shh, D'ailleurs hissed in fright. He glanced briefly into the back room. There's only one of them anyway, he whispered. She's covering the other with her little hand. He wiped away a small spatter of saliva that had landed on the reproduction.
That Ellie. She's a particularly nice girl, don't you think? He asked in a whisper. Botticelli could easily have used her as a model for that Venus. When I look at that little figure, I get along well with her, answered Eric. That's not what I mean. She looks nice, doesn't she? I thought perhaps that you and she occasionally... What do you mean? Asked Eric innocently. I only see her here. D'ailleurs smiled cleverly and tapped him confidentially on the arm. I mean here, under the work. A little kiss perhaps now and then when I'm downstairs for a moment. Understand me correctly. I don't hold it against either of you. You're both young. Think about it. A girl that age. She sits here shut in all day, and meanwhile her youth is passing by. I have enough trouble already with the lampshades, said Eric. He's simply working himself up at the idea that we make love in that stinking hole of his, thought Eric. Among the bottles of craquelure varnish and rolls of drawing paper. Or did he just see or hear something? She let herself go so freely. I should look through the keyhole sometime. Oh, come on, don't try to fool me, said D'ailleurs. You're a healthy young man, aren't you? If I were you... He suddenly stopped and made elegant gestures over the book. The sliding doors opened a little, and Mevrouw's head appeared in the salon again. See, that's what I mean, working with those elegant lines. Shall I make some coffee? How lovely, said D'ailleurs. Would you like it brought in here? Yes, but, said D'ailleurs. It's not very cozy for Ellie, said Eric. I quite forgot that dear girl, said Mevrouw. Then I'll have the maid bring it up. What are you looking at? She asked. She slid the glass doors wider open and came toward them. Padeltje, the fat little miniature pincher, trotted stiffly ahead of her. Eric immediately felt that wet dog nose pressed against his groin. When he covertly pinched it in its old balding skin, it ran off yapping. Before his wife could bend over him, D'ailleurs quickly turned the page away from The Birth of Venus. Just look at this Madonna with child, he said. They call that a swan neck. Well, it's a little too long for my taste, said Mevrouw. Mannered. That's not natural anymore, but Botticelli is magnificent. She processed out of the salon and called for the maid in the hallway. D'ailleurs stood up and put the book back in the cabinet. Eric stood up too. His knees ached. Do you know what it is? Said D'ailleurs, letting Eric go first to the door. Everything turns out differently from what you imagine when you're young. You graduate in law. You think you've made it. Before Eric could open the door, he grabbed the door handle himself, but kept the door closed. But times have changed, and you get no chance to build a practice. Can you understand that? Eric nodded. Of course I can understand that, he thought. You also look so unprepossessing. Every time you had to plead a case, the public prosecutor mistook you for the defendant. And then you give it up, D'ailleurs continued. Before the war, people with doctorates were working as tram conductors. I managed to carve out a living for myself because I'm not ungifted as a painter.
But if you knew how my forefathers lived, the revolution put an end to everything then. How heroically those people died. They were too proud to defend themselves against the rabble. They died elegantly, as they had lived. He released the door handle and stood on one leg while tilting his pelvis femininely and extending his other leg exaggeratedly forward. He held his hand gracefully under his upturned nose and sniffed audibly with a heavenly expression of rapture. In mortal danger they took snuff and refused to raise arms against the mob. That is how they were cowardly murdered. Not all of them, though, said Eric mockingly. Irritated, D'ailleurs came out of his elegant posture and swung the door open for Eric. No, otherwise I wouldn't be here. My ancestors slipped through the net, he said with comic bitterness. Surely saved by the Scarlet Pimpernel, said Eric as seriously as possible. You should take such wild stories with a very large pinch of salt, said D'ailleurs, and followed him up the stairs. Chapter 8.